Welcome, Excellencies, special guests, bienvenue. Excellences et distingués. Quelle joie de vous voir en personne. It's really a great pleasure to be together in person. Thank you for coming. We do welcome you to this seminar, Insights into the Conservative Party Leadership Contest. And even if you've been following really closely, hearing the English debates and the French one last night, trying out your French, I believe we're all going to gain some insights today through our panelists, Mike Donison and Adam Bolek as well. So for the past 6 years, because of the request of the diplomat, in fact, or several, we've offered similar events on various party leadership campaigns. My name is Darlene Klein. I'm Executive Director of the Christian Embassy, and the team and I are very, very pleased to welcome you today for this event. And in fact, I don't know if you're aware, but today is actually a special day in the Christian church calendar. It's considered Ascension Day, when Jesus left this earth and was taken up to be with his Father, in fact, seated at his right hand. So in that place of authority. And what's fascinating too is he said to all those who know him and his disciples before he ascended, that he's given all authority to us. So a fascinating promise saying that he will never leave or forsake us. So a little bit about the Christian Embassy, some of you know. We are part of a network of 10 Christian embassies around the world that exist to help to connect you with one another and with our Creator, but also to facilitate trusted relationships with parliamentary, diplomatic, and professional leaders. So whether it's through a presentation like this, an English class, a business tour, luncheon, or otherwise, we want to give opportunity for that. And so we do seek to support and encourage you and parliamentary leaders from all political parties, particularly in the desire to know and to honor God. So I will invite Mike's good friend, Adam Bolek, who currently works as head of global government affairs at OpenText, one of our largest software companies. He has 15 years experience in public and government affairs, politics, campaigns, and research, and is a former vice president at Crestview Strategies. He has advised political parties and leaders around the world, as well as corporate and nonprofit leaders. So he has many insights to share with us. And then, now on the screen with us, thank you, Mike. We welcome him back. Mike's been with us a number of times. He hails from British Columbia, where he's practiced law and taught political science courses at the University of Victoria. Was a political consultant and analyst for more than 20 federal and provincial elections. You can give the exact count. He served in a number of political roles in Ottawa and is frequently sought after by many for his insights. He's passionate about politics and continues to be involved even during his retirement. And then finally, it's my honor to present to you our interviewer, Albrecht, former MP for Kitchener-Conestoga, Ontario, for about 14 years, and prior to that, a dentist. In his retirement, he follows and encourages those in politics, including the leadership candidates. So if I can invite the two gentlemen.
Again, I want to add my words of welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here today. I'm looking forward to the answers these gentlemen give as much as you're looking forward to them, because I need to learn from them. These are experts that we're thrilled to have with us today. So I'm going to start off with Mike. Mike, my first question is, could you just briefly describe for us the history of the process that the Conservative Party has used in selecting their leadership?
Well, as you and our guests most of the guests will know, Canada has the British parliamentary system of government, what's called the Westminster model. And the practice and history is that when it comes to leadership of the party, that was really a process, was initially an informal process. At most, it would involve the party caucus, that is the elected MPs, but actually traditionally they weren't even involved. And it generally was a process where the leadership of the party, that is the caucus, in consultation with the leader, usually there was a consensus. The case of the Conservative Party, from the time of Macdonald right through to Sir Charles Tupper, there was never any formal consultation. There would be discussion amongst the leadership. Usually the consensus was clear. And so the first leaders were simply chosen by a fairly undemocratic process. a narrow consultation, but obviously they would have had caucus support or else they would have had difficulty. The one innovation was after Sir Charles Tupper retired in 1901, I believe, it was clear that Sir Robert Borden was the logical person to lead. He had overwhelming caucus support. I'm not aware of any formal vote. There was consultation, and he just became the leader. There was general consensus. In 1920, when he stepped down, and Sir Arthur Mahan then became the leader, again, there was an interesting dispute there. The caucus wanted Mahan. There was no actual formal votes, just a matter of consultation. But the cabinet, was still government, most of the cabinet who worked with Mahan didn't particularly like him. And most of the cabinet wanted somebody else, a fellow by the name of T.S. White, who most people, he sort of disappeared from Canadian history. He was Borden's choice, but in the end, White simply said, I'm not going to run. And so by default, Mahan became leader. And in fact, there was no caucus vote, no caucus consultation. Mr. Borden simply went with Mr. Mahan up to Government House, and the Governor General swore in Mr. Mahan as Prime Minister, and he was automatically leader of the party. Big change after that. In 1927, when Mr. Mahan stepped down and the party chose R.B. Bennett, the party decided to move very much the way the Federal Liberal Party had, away from simply, party caucus MPs only consulting, to very much an American model, a delegated party convention. That is, where what's called the extra parliamentary party, the members of the party in the country would choose delegates from each riding plus other officials, and they'd all meet in a big hall, very much like the Americans do, and they had a party convention. And the process was always that there would be several candidates, and it would be just an elimination. In other words, you'd have a vote. The person who was the bottom, there'd be another vote until somebody got a majority on the last ballot. And that was the process the Conservative Party followed from 1927 really until 1998, when Joe Clark came back to become leader of the Conservative Party. That was basically the process followed, delegated convention. In 1998, quickly, there was a change that the party decided to move because there was a lot of pressure to make it more quote unquote democratic. And so the party moved towards an idea that every single party member should have a vote, what we call one member, one vote. And in fact, they adopted that in 1998 when Mr. Clark was elected. That system, though, and we'll talk about the current one, everybody got a vote, but every riding got 100 points. And then that particular election was a little different. They actually voted in person, and there was actually a first round. And then 2 weeks later, they all went and voted in person on the second round. That's what so the party was moving towards, quote unquote, a more democratic model. Interestingly enough, in 2003, when Mr. McKay was elected leader to succeed Mr. Clark, and I believe, Adam, you were at that particular meeting, the party reverted to the delegated convention model, where they chose delegates, they met at a hall, I think in Ottawa, and Mr. McKay was elected. Since then, of course, if I can talk about the Legacy Party, which was the Canadian Alliance, as I'm talking about before the merger, the two parties, Canadian Alliance had a system of one person, one vote as well, and a similar model. Anyway, what happened when the two parties merged, the first leadership was for Mr. Harper, and they adopted a model, and it's basically the model we've had ever since. Every single member of the party has a vote. However, each riding has 100 points. Oh, there's been one modification of that. You win by the number of points, and it's simply called a preferential ballot. People simply vote, and it's called the automatic runoff, and you have a series of rounds of counts until somebody has a majority of the points.
Okay.
So that very quickly, that's been the process. So it's moved from a fairly elitist, tight process to a fairly open democratic process of selection.
Much more grassroots. Could you explain, Mike, why now we're in the middle of the third leadership selection within 5 years for the Conservative Party? How and why did this happen?
Well, the basic reason is the Conservatives have lost the last three federal elections is the simple answer. But in 2015, as you know, the Conservatives under Mr. Harper lost the election, so he stepped down. So the party had to choose a new leader. So they had to go through this process. And of course, in 2017, they did have a contest. Mr. Scheer was elected. There were 13 candidates, 12 rounds, but he was elected narrowly against Mr. Bernier on the last count. So that was the reason for that change. Unfortunately for Mr. Scheer, there was an election in 2019. The Liberals won it, although with a minority. I think Mr. Scheer and Adam may want to comment on this. I think he was a bit of his own worst enemy on this. He made a lot of mistakes. I think tactically, there's a lot of disgruntlement in the party and the caucus.
But he did win 20 odd seats, though,
Yes,
and won the popular vote.
very
He
good
did
point.
do very well in the election, maybe not as well as most wanted.
It's typical of conservatives. We're not happy until we actually win
Right.
outright.
Right.
In any case, he was forced to step down. And so they had to have another leadership race, and that was in 2020. Same process followed, and that was the process that elected Mr. O'Toole. That was in 2020. As we all know, last September 20th, there was a federal general election, and unfortunately for the Conservatives, they lost the election again. They got the same number of seats, but Mr. Trudeau came back with another minority. On October 5th, to give you the history, Mr. O'Toole just announced he said he had been consulting with people and simply said, "I'm staying on." However, there was a lot of discontent in the caucus. You had a national council member and a senator trying to get a nationwide petition to get the party to amend to force the leadership race. A lot of discontent over Mr. O'Toole's leadership, which maybe Adam can talk about. As I'm going through this fairly quickly. As a result, in January, there was a lot of discontent, and there was a change. And I want to say this is the next major change, because what happened, as I said, always the leader was chosen not by the caucus, nor could he be removed by the caucus, but by the party. However, a member of caucus by the name of Michael Chong introduced legislation a few years ago, which actually became adopted, became known as the Reform Act. It actually now is incorporated in an Act of Parliament, the Parliament of Canada Act. And that simply requires that at the beginning of each parliament, each parliamentary caucus at their first meeting have to make a decision whether they want to opt in, as it says, to the provisions of the Act. And if they choose to opt in, one of the things they do, one of the rules is that at any time, if 20% of the elected MPs of any caucus sign a letter to the caucus chair asking for a secret ballot of all the MPs on the leader, that vote has to be held. And that's exactly what happened in this case, because for the first time, or maybe the second parliament in a row, the Conservative Party chose at the beginning of the new parliament to adopt the Reform Act. By the way, all the other caucuses have never adopted it. The Liberals, the NDP, never have adopted it. The Conservatives, Mr. O'Toole even voted for it to adopt it. He may have regretted that.
He welcomed it too. That's
He
important to
welcomed
mention. Aaron O'Toole said the party should adopt this and shouldn't
Right.
put me to the test if they choose the caucus.
So unfortunately, on January 31st, an MP by the name of Benson, I believe, he organized a letter, and 37 or 39 Conservative MPs signed it. They constituted 29% of the caucus. And of course, the Act only said it took 20%, magical number 24. So there was no choice. Mr. Reid had to call a vote. The caucus met on February the 2nd, and on a secret ballot, the caucus voted 73 to 45 to oust Mr. O'Toole. So all of a sudden, the party now had a third vacancy in its leadership. And interesting, the Reform Act, pardon the expression, it trumps, pardon the expression, it trumps any party constitution, right? And it basically says the caucus does this, and then all that the Act says is then the party, under its own constitution, chooses a new leader. So here we are. So that's the reason we're into this third contest in 5 years.
In terms of the current race, Mike, with the contestants who have lined up to vie for the position and the rules that are in place for the conduct of the leadership race, do you think that the process is fair for the contestants? And do you think it gives the average person who is interested in choosing the leader a fair crack at their choice in terms of who they will choose as the leadership?
I'll answer the second part of your question first. I think it is fair and democratic for Canadians. All that you have to do to become a participant is you join the Conservative Party of Canada. You pay a monstrous $10. And as long as you pay that by June the 3rd, you get a vote.
$15, Mike.
$15. You're still thinking back.
Inflation.
I love correcting Mike.
$15. Okay, $15. And in any case, so I think it is open and democratic. Is it fair to the candidates? one of the criticisms is the amount of money that candidates have to come up with for the deadline. And basically they have to come up with $300,000, which is a lot of money to raise under the current Canada Elections Act rules for raising money. But in any case, 6 candidates were able to do so. That's a lot of money. I estimate, though, the party also, every dollar you raise, you have to run it through the party, and the party charges you a fee on it. So my estimation, to be eligible, you have to raise about $350,000 to meet the deadline. There was basically a requirement of a $100,000 registration fee and a $100,000 non-compliance fee, which is refunded if you behave yourself. So it was quite a bit of money. So there's a bit of some gatekeeping there. But I think it's reasonably open. And Adam may want to talk about that. 6 candidates didn't seem to have any trouble meeting those requirements.
Okay, we'll go into a little we'll go into that a bit more deeply later. But what do you suggest are the fundamental issues that the Conservative Party is dealing with during this leadership race? What are the fundamental issues that are coming to the front?
Well, I think the fundamental issue that's facing the party internally, not in terms of particular issues of public policy, is really where the party wants to go. And Adam, again, may want to comment on that, but this is increasingly looking like a contest between Mr. Poilievre on the one hand and Mr. Charest, although Mr. Brown is certainly moving up on the numbers, I suspect. And I think the issue the party has to face and Conservatives have to face, some of my Conservative friends don't like me putting it in these terms, but I think the party is faced with a situation where there is Mr. Poilievre really represents a truly right of center, frank, open, populist Conservative position. Mr. Charest very much represents, in all due respect, a bit of the old style of politics. He was the former leader of the old Progressive Conservative Party. He's certainly very experienced, but he's a bit of the old style of politics. And I think that Conservatives have to ask themselves this question. Do we want to win? Is the name of the game to win, or is the name of the game to stand for Conservative principles? And there's a lot of feeling, a lot of party that Mr. Poilievre will very much probably win the leadership. He'll probably unite the party, but can he win the country? And a lot of party members are concerned about that. On the other hand, Mr. Charest, who probably will have much more difficulty winning the party and keeping it united, is probably superficially more electable with the general elected in terms of broadening the base of the party. So those on the populist Conservative side are saying the trouble with Charest is fine, we formed government, but there's no basic change in public policy in the country from the Liberals at all. And so I think that's what they're facing. Is the name of the game simply to win at all costs? Is there a limit, and do we want to be principled even if the price we pay is perhaps we don't obtain office?
Thanks so much, Mike. We'll come back to you a little bit later. Minutes now. Adam, we hear a lot about, in terms of the leadership race, that the on-the-ground game is so important. So selling memberships is one thing, that's a big issue. But then the other side of that is that you can sell memberships, but you have to get your members out to vote. Otherwise, your memberships sold are of little value. Are those two factors still important in this race, the ground game?
Short answer is 100% yes, but you got to remember this is a relatively quick leadership. I think during the Scheer leadership back in 2017, it was almost a year. And of course, the leadership we had after Mr. Scheer was a little bit longer than this one. And in both those elections in 2017 and in 2020, the amount of people who bought memberships and voted was relatively the same when it came down to the final ballot. About 140,000 people cast ballots in the end. So yeah, it's important, but at the same time, it's largely the same amount of members who are going to be voting this time as last time. So as important as it is to sell cards, first of all, that window closes, as Mike said, basically next week. So you haven't had that all that long. But that's also why I think you're seeing a lot of emphasis on spending a lot of time with members and trying to convince them that they're the leadership candidate to lead the party into the next election. And so I think a lot of this is Mike's talking about sort of winning the hearts and minds of the current Conservative base. That's why there's so much focus on winning that existing membership, because I don't think it's going to grow very much.
So the next question I have is, if you were to decide today who's most likely to win this leadership race, who would you suggest is the front runner? And what are some issues that could possibly keep that front runner from achieving his or her goal? And is it possible for another candidate to overtake that front runner at this point?
Yeah, I think Mike mentioned this earlier when he was speaking as well. Look, I think it's Pierre's to lose. I really do. I think 3 or 4 months ago when all this started, it was very clear Pierre was the front runner, and I still think remains the front runner. He had lots of endorsements from caucus. He's always been very popular amongst the base of the party. He traveled the country quite a bit in speaking, and many of you may have seen he was on YouTube quite a bit and on social media quite a bit, even before the leadership, talking about inflation, talking about the cost of living. And he's been quite outspoken and vocal about that. And many have seen, you may have even seen him in Parliament. This is something as finance critic, he made front and center, even before inflation was starting to hit the front page of newspapers and people's minds. And when you're going to fill up your car and seeing when the price of gas was still reasonable at $1.20, not a few months ago, Pierre was sort of front and center on that. So I still think it's Pierre's to lose, but as Mike said too, I think Patrick Brown is catching up rather quickly. And when I talk to friends who are working on the campaigns and who are also working at party headquarters, up to this point, a lot of the memberships going in were coming from Pierre's campaign. You're now seeing a number come in from Patrick's campaign, and Charest's have been fairly steady, but I don't think his have been as large. Now, Patrick's also one of the last contestants to sign up and get his deposit in and whatnot. But Patrick Brown is one heck of an organizer. This is a guy who won the Ontario leadership race quite quickly and handily too, beating a popular MPP in Christine Elliott, who was also Jim Flaherty's wife and a leader in the provincial party. After Patrick was thrown out of being the Ontario PC leader in Ontario, within a month, he decided to run for mayor of Brampton and won. And beat a popular incumbent mayor in one of Canada's biggest and most diverse cities. So I wouldn't underestimate Patrick's ability to sell memberships, particularly to non-traditional conservative communities. Patrick's been very, very good at reaching out to Canadians of all different types of faiths and all different types of backgrounds, particularly newer Canadians. So I really wouldn't underestimate that. I think, to be honest, I think Leslyn Lewis and Jean Charest are kind of in a battle for third place. I think Jean Charest, to Mike's point, is right. I think he's running for his father's PC party in the sense that I don't think he recognizes the Conservative Party as it is today. It's been almost 25 years since he's been in Ottawa. I think there's been some generational changes. And I think the folks he's trying to appeal to in terms of sort of more moderate members of the party, or trying to attract more moderate members of the party, I think it's a tough sell. As I said, it's going to be largely the same people who voted in the last leadership are voting in this leadership. I'm not sure there's a lot of room for that at this time around. And I think with Leslyn Lewis, being a strong social conservative and a strong representation, I think, of Christian values, I think she's got a very sort of solid base she's working from. But I also think because Pierre is a little more right of center than some of the other candidates, I think there's some crossover appeal there as well. So I actually think she's probably starting to worry about him a little bit. And just very briefly on some of the other candidates, Scott Aitchison and Roman Baber. Roman Baber is kind of a surprise. This is somebody who was elected for the first time to the provincial parliament from Toronto last election. He's an Israeli Canadian. I think he was born in Russia, but then went to Israel before coming here. He was thrown out of the PC party by Premier Ford for some of his more controversial views on lockdowns and opening up during the pandemic. He was very aggressive and trying to persuade his colleagues, we have to open up now, we have to get businesses running again and whatnot. And so he was thrown out of the caucus. And he then very quickly put together a leadership campaign and put together the $300,000 and put his name forward. I'm not sure if he's going to run federally or not. We'll see. I think there's plenty of opportunities for him to do that. I think he's very much appealing to folks in the Conservative Party who are very concerned about some of the things that happened during lockdowns and during the pandemic. And then also Scott Aitchison, who's a new MP for Muskoka. He's a former long-term mayor of Huntsville, which is a fairly sizable town in that part of the country. I think Scott's aim is a little more, I don't think he's trying to talk about policy, although I'm not sure the members are warming up to it, because nobody really wants to talk about policy. Nobody wants to talk about how much health transfers or tax policy. They want to talk about some of the things Mike was talking about, inflation, how are we going to beat Trudeau, that kind of stuff. But I think Scott's appeal to members is much more tonal in nature. Mm-hmm. Scott is far less, I think the least likely, the candidate who's least attacked other members. He's sort of very much a return to civility kind of candidate. But I also think that's part of his strategy, is to sort of be the most likable, friendly, warm candidate despite his relatively low profile. And I think for him and for Roman Baber to some extent, a lot of this is about maintaining profile in the party. Maybe they'll run for leader again. Maybe they just want to stay on the front bench of the party or have a shot at a cabinet seat. But I think it's a lot of it's about profile for those.
Just want to pick up on what you said about Roman Baber in terms of will he run for office? I think we need to clarify that you're referring to, will he stay and run as a candidate in a riding should he lose the
That's right.
leadership?
Yeah, to become a federal MP because it's still a sitting provincial MP.
Right.
And he's
You
not
also
running again.
mentioned Leslyn Lewis. I just want to pick up a little more about your comments on her. She is probably seen as the person who is primarily looking at the values votes or the social conservative vote or the Christian vote. And do you think that going forward that we'll be relegated to having only one candidate who represents that side of the party? Or what are your comments on how we should look at that from a perspective of values, social conservative values, Christian values, however you want to define that?
Yeah, look, I'm a Catholic, born and raised, and I'd like to say I'm devout, but that's between me and my priest, I guess. We'll see. So these issues are very important to me, but joy cometh in the morning, Scripture tells us. So I'm always very optimistic about how these things play out, even though it looks like these issues aren't front and center or may not be growing within the party at this point. Look, don't forget about the last leadership. Leslyn won the most votes in Western Canada at one point in time and I think was quite a big surprise. I also think it was interesting that despite all her support in the party, she wasn't put on the front bench and given a prominent critic role by the previous leader, which I think may have cost Aaron O'Toole some support within the caucus later on. But I think our caucus does a very good job at keeping these issues front and center. I think we're very lucky to have members like Kathy Wagenthal, who was with us earlier, who are very good at voicing these issues. And the other thing I'll say is, as I get into middle age, and I now have a daughter, and I look at these things. I used to think of myself as one of the younger folks in the party, but I look at the next generation coming up, and these issues are very motivating for a lot of young folks. And I think you're starting to see a lot of younger folks. When you go into campaigns now, it's not old farts like me at 36 running campaigns. It's young folks that are 21 and 22 taking time out of school doing it. And quite frankly, I have a lot of hope that we are going to continue to grow the importance of these values as we go forward. And I think you're going to see that too in the leadership as well. I still think Leslyn is going to do very well, but Pierre's, I think, been pretty good on these issues up to this point as well too. So
okay, great. Thank you. We hear a lot about Jean Charest and how he has raised an incredible amount of money in a very short time, and Pierre Poilievre and Patrick Brown have also done an incredible job of raising a lot of money in a very short time. Is the money that they raise, does it actually translate into votes, or can they count on that? Or how does that measure up in your opinion?
I think the first thing I'd say is in the Conservative Party, we believe money is speech, right? We believe that's a way of communicating your support in a very tangible way. As Mike said, $300,000. I don't know if any of you have ever worked on campaigns or if any of you have had to raise money for an event or an organization like this. It's hard, particularly in Ottawa, when the rules are you can only write a check at $1,500 at a time. I think that's the number, Mike. $1,675. And so it's hard. That's a lot of checks, single checks, if people are giving you the most they can. But the fact that Roman Baber and Scott Aitchison, who are relatively unknown up to this point, could put together $300,000 in a couple of months shows you that there are members willing to write those checks who see value in supporting those candidates, even though it would be very apparent to some of our donors that they may not have had the best chance of winning, but they believed in what those candidates had to say and wanted to make sure those messages were heard during the leadership. So the short answer is yes. But also, if you look at Jean Charest's network, I mean, he was a sitting former popular premier of Quebec. He was a former PC leader. He's a very charismatic guy. For those of you that have ever been to an event with him or met him or seen him at events, but he has a very robust business network to tap into, I think. And the same and Pierre's donors are very much, I would say, traditional conservative voters. I don't think Pierre is getting too many of those $1,600 checks. I think he's getting more in the couple of $100 ranges. But again, it speaks to the ability that there are members that want to hear them speak during the leadership and want their views represented. So, and all this stuff costs a lot of money.
Yeah. One of the things that came up in the debate last night was a number of the candidates referred to the fact that they're growing the party. They're bringing new members into the party. And Charest and Brown and Poilievre especially are focusing on bringing new members into the party. How are they going about that? What are your position on that?
I'll start with Charest. I think, as I said, Charest's appeal is very much to what Mike was talking about, when we kind of have to bring the party back to the center, appeal to as many Canadians as we can. And he's hoping that translates to as many Canadians, who maybe have not involved, certainly in conservative politics or politics at all, join the party in trying to bring more moderate appeal into the party. And I don't know if he's succeeding, but that's certainly his strategy and what he's trying to do. I think when it comes to Patrick Brown, he's very much appealing to communities that conservative leaders and conservative parties have never really appealed to before. You're seeing him work a lot with organized labor, which is something that's happened a bit in Ontario with Doug Ford, but is still relatively new for the Conservative Party. You're seeing Patrick Brown, I know he was attending a Unifor event in Ottawa just a few weeks ago, which is very unusual for a Conservative leadership candidate, or even a Conservative MP. And Patrick is also very much getting involved with the Sikh community, the Tamil community, Sri Lankan community, and he's also reaching out to Muslim Canadians, which is something, again, not typical for a Conservative leadership candidate. But again, as I said, I think he's the strongest organizer and hardest worker amongst the candidates. And so I don't doubt his ability to convince these folks to join the Conservative Party and have a voice and have a say on this leadership. And as I've heard, he's selling memberships and he's doing exactly what he needs to do in succeeding.
Okay, well, thanks to both of you for your insights on those questions. We're going to open it up now to the floor, and we hope that some of you have some questions.
Hard questions, difficult questions.
And not the easy ones like I did.
I think two reasons, maybe three reasons why he decided not to run this time. The first and sort of most practical one is he still has debt from the last leadership. Mike might know the number, but I think it was close to $1 million of debt that he had from his last campaign that he has to pay back relatively quickly. So as Mike said, Jean Charest, I think, has crossed the $2 million raised already, and most candidates had to put together 300,000. When you're starting on the back foot and you're down $1 million in the hole already, it makes it, from a practical standpoint, really hard to get, because you have to pay that debt before you can put money into the party for the new race. I think the second reason is I think Peter was seen as the front runner last time. He was, a popular, charismatic fellow, but I think he was quite disappointed in the result of the leadership. I think he was quite shocked at how, and particularly some of his campaign workers were shocked at how little support he got in the end for somebody who was supposed to win it quite handily, I think. So I think that sort of probably gave him some pause to rethink about to think strongly about whether or not he wanted to try again. And I think the third reason is he's a fairly young family. I think it took a lot of convincing because as Harold will tell you, it's quite a stress on family life, particularly if you're going to run not just for MP, but also federal leader. The amount of time you have to spend on the road and away with your family, even if you can bring them, you're not always with them. And so Peter's got, despite his age, he's got a number of kids who are under the age of 7 and 8. I think he's got 3. And so I think he just elected after that leadership, I want to spend more time with them and get back into business.
Mike, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add about Mr. McKay, he'll go down in history as the prime minister or leader we didn't get. I think, and I can speak for a lot of people in the party, I certainly am disappointed he didn't run. I think Mr. McKay would kind of offer, let's put it this way, I was talking about this division in the party about populism and electability. I think Mr. McKay, much more so than Mr. Charest, could have attracted a lot more of the traditional base of the party and still be quote unquote a moderate. And I just think this was this is it for him. And I really think he should have ran. And I think it's an actual loss to the party that he's not a candidate. And they were all very good. I understand why he's not. By the way, I think his debt, Adam, is down to about 300,000. So it's still quite a bit. But I think there's a real lost opportunity here for the party. As I think he's someone who could have united all the wings of the party better than either of the two major candidates running at the moment, in my opinion.
Yeah,
thank you.
I agree.
Great question. Thank you for that question. Great
Thank
question. I think from the number of people who responded last night and how they responded, they think it will. So I'm going to ask our guests what their thoughts are. Mike, you go first on this one. Were you able to pick that up?
Yeah, I don't think there's much difference amongst most of the candidates. I think the difficult problem for the Conservative Party is, and I'm just going to be frank here. I realize there's a lot of interest over these bills. I think something's changed in the country. I'm not so sure that outside of Quebec, very many Canadians are particularly worked up about this issue. Certainly not Conservative Party members. Inside Quebec, the problem is this issue only resonates mostly in Quebec amongst the non-Francophone minorities. And those non-Francophone minorities, I'm just being very calculating here, overwhelmingly vote Liberal and will continue to vote Liberal. The actual base of the Conservative Party in Quebec is nationalist, rural, and therefore very much in favor of this kind of legislation. So I think the difficulty is whoever becomes Conservative leader, how they're going to deal with, for instance, the 10 Conservative MPs from Quebec, including Mr. Charest. So I think there's been an awful lot of rhetoric on this, quite frankly, on C21. I understand why, but I'm not so sure I think it's going to be a problem.
Well, and I'll build on that a little bit, Mike. One of the things that I had heard particularly before Christmas, before Mr. O'Toole's leadership had ended and before things really came to a head, one of the major issues within the Conservative caucus was this issue about what the leader or what the party should say about Bill 21. To Mike's point, though, it doesn't really have a lot of interest to members outside of Quebec. But of course, winning seats in Quebec is really important to a Conservative Party forming government and certainly forming a majority. There's just not enough seats that are winnable practically outside of Quebec. So in many ways, even though it's a small issue for a relatively small geographic part of the country, it's really important when you're talking seat by seat and you're trying to get to that magic number of 171, I think, right, Mike? So, the thing I would say is, and it was, as I said, it was a big deal to Quebec caucus members who made all kinds of threats saying, if the leader or anybody says anything that's, aggressive in any way about Bill 21, for or against, that affects our seats. And they have quite a bit of, I think, amongst, and Quebec has always had an outsized influence on the Conservative Party because they're that final piece of the puzzle to government. And so that's, as Mike said, it's a really difficult balance between sort of doing what would be the right thing or trying to compromise your position on something like this. Because as Mike said, most members would say, yeah, no, these are silly bills. But to our folks in Quebec, it really matters a lot. And they think their seats and their political fortunes depend on it quite a bit. The short answer is yes. There's a theory among some of my organizer friends that if any of you are familiar with Moneyball or sort of, there's a baseball theory that you can actually structure a team based on statistics and not personality or your belief you're going to win. And the idea is you put the folks who are going to score the most bases on deck, even though they may not be the best players. It's all about consistency. And so if you apply that principle to the point system, yeah, a rural riding in Quebec that the Conservative Party has never held may only have 10 members, but they still have 100 points. That's the floor. Conversely, you go to a riding, I don't know, like Pierre's riding, which would have several thousand active Conservative members just down the road here in Carleton, but they still only have 100 points. So if you're thinking about where do I spend my money, where do I spend my time, where do I send my organizers, maybe there's more benefit to going to some of these smaller neglected ridings where there aren't very many members. Because if you get 100 members on your side, that's 100 votes. Particularly where there's no infrastructure organization. So I think I would not be surprised if Mr. Brown is spending a lot of time in some ridings off the beaten path where Conservatives haven't done very, very well. But I will say the other part of his strategy certainly would be to spend some time in places where we don't hold the seats, where we have won before, places like Brampton, Peel, across the GTA, maybe even some of the suburbs of Vancouver or Calgary too. But there is something there. Now, I think all of the candidates will look at that and think there's an opportunity there, but it's all about juggling resources and time, and it's a moving target. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Patrick in some of these smaller, forgotten about ridings. I'll say one last quick thing too. one of the things that I've heard from my friends in party headquarters is that they've been getting calls or requests from ridings that haven't been very active for a long time. Some ridings in Newfoundland, some ridings in Eastern Canada and Quebec, where there's been barely a riding association or a local party membership. But folks are now calling and saying, we want Pierre to come through our riding. How do we get Pierre here? Pierre's really piqued our interest. So, that shows you that Pierre's message, even though, it may be a little bit more right-wing and populist, is having resonance and is working, which is one of the reasons why he stuck to it as well, I think.
Yeah, the only point I just add to that, just a detail, Adam, actually, you talk about these small ridings or small numbers, particularly in rural Quebec and even in the Maritimes. There actually was a change in the rules. The example you gave, if only 10 people vote, it only gets 10 points.
10 points, right. Excuse me. Yeah.
But as long as there's 100 people vote in a riding, that's not a lot of people, it gets the full 100 points. The other thing I would add is I agree with you about Patrick Brown's strategy. We used to call these kind of ridings rotten boroughs, expression. But I think Mr. Charest is also doing that. I think Mr. Charest would be well advised to work a lot of those Quebec seats and Maritime seats where there isn't a big membership to get his points up. Because as we should all remember, in the last leadership race on the second round, Leslyn Lewis actually won the most popular vote. She got more people voting on the second preference across the country, but she was third in the points, so she got eliminated for the last round. So that's just something to keep in mind.
And so the point system is really important in terms of getting equal representation across the country, because a riding like in middle of Alberta, for example, might have 6,000 members. And if those members all voted for one candidate, they would overly influence the election across the Canada. So we want an equal value of points across the country. I think that's so it works to your advantage in a small area, small riding, but it works to your disadvantage in a larger area. So Patrick Brown, who's from Brampton, even if he has 5,000 members in his riding, he can't win the leadership with those 5,000 members. He's got to spread himself equally across the country.
Yeah, the thing I just add about this point system, historically, it's very fundamental to the party. The only reason we've got the new Conservative Party is because Mr. Harper agreed with Mr. McKay to allow the point system, because Mr. McKay's concern was the Canadian Alliance was a much larger party in terms of membership, probably about 8 times the old PC party. And so this is really ingrained now in the, the genetics of our party. I think this point system is really here to stay. And as you say, it's very important to give a more equal representation across the country.
And just one more quick thing, because we're talking about East and West here a little bit about the heritage of the party. I'm not as convinced that Jean Charest is going to do as well in Quebec as people think as well. Maybe because he didn't have he didn't leave office on the best of terms. I think he was defeated in that election in 2007, Mike, was it? Or 2012, excuse me.
2012, yes.
2012. And, as a premier, he was right of center, but I would say barely. Now, he also had quite a different coalition when it came to trying to govern the province of Quebec. And the reasons he went, of course, were just after the Quebec referendum, when Quebec almost left the country or took a referendum to almost leave. So it was not an easy job, and he had to make some difficult decisions. But I'm not all convinced that he's going to have the lead in Quebec out the gate. The other thing I'll just say about Jean Charest too is, and Mike's an old reformer. Was where he started in politics and in BC, so he can comment on this further. But when I started in politics, when the PC party and Alliance were divided, there was not a lot of love for Mr. Charest in Western Canada because he would take quite a bit of shots at the old Reform Party then, which dominated in the West. And Charest, to his credit, was able to win almost 20 seats. Coming up from 2 seats between 1993 and 1997, a lot of that on the back of criticizing the Reform Party and the Alliance, rightly or wrongly. And so I think west of the Lakehead, particularly in the Prairie provinces, I think Jean Charest is going to have a really, really tough time, because a lot of, as I said, the membership changes a little bit, leadership by leadership, but certainly I think west of the Lakehead, a lot of those members who would have voted in the last 4 or 5 leaderships will remember Jean Charest and will not have a lot of forgiveness for what he would have said and did during the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate that. Mind you, I didn't start politics. You called me an old reformer, Adam. I actually was an
You're not
old.
a young reformer, Mike.
I originally got into politics as a progressive conservative when John Diefenbaker was leader. So I was actually started politics PC. But anyway, there's still a lot of us in the party who remember the 1997 federal general election, which you mentioned. And in that election, it was not Jean Chrétien who went across the country demonizing the Reform Party and accusing Manning of all sorts of, un-Canadian positions. It was Jean Charest, the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, who really trashed the Reform Party. And there's still a lot of people in the party who haven't forgotten that. I'm not so sure Mr. Charest, he may be underestimating, particularly in Western Canada, the degree of that still antagonism. No, it's obviously abated. We're talking about
25 years ago,
years ago now, but there's long memories in politics. Staying out of sight as much as possible.
Yeah.
Well, but I will say early on in this leadership, there were rumors that Mr. Harper was keen to get involved because Mr. Charest was going to be involved. If you remember, there was some crossover between Prime Minister Harper while Jean Charest was the Premier of Quebec, and they had a number of disagreements that were very political in nature over, Harold, it was transfer payments and tax cuts and all kinds of issues. Energy files were a big problem at one point. And Mr. Harper is not a fan of Mr. Charest. He made that very clear, not himself, but through surrogates. It was written up in newspapers and whatnot. But he has no visible role. But I don't know if I would completely discount his involvement, but it's officially no. Mike's right. He's not doing anything.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that there were these stories. Yeah, I think probably Mr. Harper would not be too pleased. I can't speak for him. If Mr. Charest wins the leadership, he'll see that as a kind of reversion back to the old Progressive Conservative Party. I think that's the way he'll see it. But yeah, he's laying low. But of course, I have no idea if he or people who are supporting him are working for any candidates or not. I don't have any intelligence on that.
Thank you, and I'm going to go to my friend here. So, will you want to respond to the second part of the question?
Yeah. On your question of what role is foreign policy playing, I honestly don't think there's a lot of difference in the candidates' views on foreign policy. If you look at what they've all said on issues ranging from Ukraine to trade, even energy issues, everybody wants to build a pipeline. Everybody wants to get that pipeline built to the States. Everybody's been fairly harmonious when it comes to things like their views on the Russian war in Ukraine and other things. I think there's been a little bit of difference on some things like the party's views on Israel. I think Patrick Brown has said that, he may not be as keen on moving the Canadian embassy to Jerusalem, which is, again, these little small things matter a great deal in partisan politics. But for the most part, I haven't seen a whole lot of variance on views. If it hasn't come up much in the leadership debates either. If you watch the debates, it's all about, the trucker convoys or inflation, or a lot of, honestly, personal attacks or ethics issues that the various candidates have had over the years. So I think one of the reasons you're not hearing much about it is there's not a lot of difference to exploit, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that on foreign policy. Of course, there is a huge elephant in the room, and kind of surprises me in terms of the world geopolitical situation. Our guests will be interested in. There's been no discussion on Canada-China relations at all. It's amazing the geopolitical world we're in today, and I think it's probably because they probably are all in agreement. Maybe it's just not an issue, but it is interesting that it just hasn't come up in the debate at all.
No, I think Mike just made an important reference when he said China. I think the only thing early on, I don't know if it happened last night again, Mike, because I didn't watch the French debate, but my understanding, and the debate I attended here in Ottawa at the Manning Conference or the True North Conference, there was a lot of time spent about talking about Mr. Charest's association with Huawei, a Chinese telecom company, when he was in private practice as a lawyer, and attacking him and saying he may have had sympathies for China. But I think Charest did a fairly good job defending himself from that attack. But again, you haven't heard much about that since then, because I think it largely didn't work. There was an issue. Again, I think there's not a lot of daylight between the candidates on their views on things like China or any of these other big foreign policy questions. On sort of Leslyn Lewis's effect on the last leadership and what may happen this time, I think that's right. I think where her votes go will be really, really important if she's not first or second on the final ballot, which I'd say today is not the case. I think unlike last time, though, I think a lot of those voters are going to be very careful who they pick, because last time Aaron O'Toole made a big point of saying social conservatives will have a place in the party. I will make sure I listen to them. And then Miss Lewis was excluded from the front bench. And you recall he took some, I guess, controversial positions when it came to some issues around life issues and around gender selection and a whole bunch of other things that would have been contrary to what Miss Lewis would have, I think, had a natural position on. So I think they're going to be a little bit more careful about this and believing what these candidates, frontrunner candidates, might have to say on these issues. But I will just say, I think unlike last time, where Peter, I think, had a lot of difficulty attracting those kinds of values votes, I think Pierre I think a lot of voters that would have Leslyn Lewis as their first choice will naturally gravitate towards Pierre because his record is pretty good on these things. He may not be addressing it outright, I think, but I also think because of the riding he's in, because of the length of time he spent in the party and where he aligns on issues, they'll be relatively important to him, and he'll want to make sure he doesn't forget them because he sees it as an important part of the coalition in terms of winning the country as well.
Okay, if I can go to Mike then for the second part of the question relating to the US politics and how the conservative movement in the US is affecting the conservative movement here. I think that's the basis of your question. Yeah.
I've always been very hesitant to draw a lot of conclusions on the activities, political activities in our great republic to the south of us and transferring that to our system. Yes, we're very close to America in so many ways, well, geographically, of course, and economically, but we have a very different political in Canada. And I'm not so sure all these American issues, I mean, they're being raised here, but I think sometimes we artificially transfer the disputes that are going on in America to our politics. I personally we did a little less of that and just looked at our politics in terms of our nation and the issues that face it. I'm sure Adam will have something. I'm
going to disagree.
Yeah, and I figured it would, just on the social control.
Yeah, look,
very quickly, if I can, just on the first question. Most people who are going to vote for Leslyn Lewis, they're either not going to vote for anybody else. They may just plump for her.
It's also true.
But it's clear to me that although he hasn't drawn out on this, although Mr. Poilievre has not been, 100% pure, so to speak, on the so-called social conservative issues, there's no question that Mr. Charest is a social liberal. There's no question of that. And so most social conservatives in the party, with all respect to Mr. Charest, I can't see very many of them giving their second to Charest. At least with Pierre Poilievre, there will be a role and a position of debate within the party for social conservatives. I can't see very much role of anything for them in a party led by Mr. Charest. Again, with all respect to Mr. Charest, I just think that's where he stands.
So I do disagree with Mike a little bit. Look, I've worked on campaigns in the United States, including in 2016. I'll just say this about populism in general. It's a global phenomenon now, right? It is particularly in the English-speaking world, but I think it's also starting to have an effect in other parts of the world as well. And in 2016, when I was in New Hampshire and I spent some time with the Trump campaign at the time, I asked them, I said, so why does he think he's going to win this? What is tell me why you think you have a chance. And a lot of them, particularly when he started to win more and more primaries, one of the things Trump said is he believed he would not have won if it weren't for the Brexit vote. And if the Brexit vote didn't go the way he thought, didn't go the way it did, perhaps we would not have had Mr. Trump running as aggressively as he did at the time. And that has all kinds of effects, which you can't get into. So I think all these little things do have an effect on our politics in some way or another. More recently, though, as no doubt many in this room know, that there's been some controversial leaks from the Supreme Court in the United States about Roe v. Wade. Within, I think, 36 hours of that, the Liberal Party of Canada sent out an email, a fundraising email to its members saying, we will protect a woman's right to choose. I think that right's been pretty safe in this country for a long, long time, but they were leveraging that as a way to raise campaign contributions from their base. If you think that that's not going to become an issue, the Liberals aren't going to try and make that an issue for the Conservatives during the leadership, irrespective of, it could even be Mr. Charest, and they're still going to try and convince Canadians that Charest is leading a party full of social conservatives, that will have an impact. And I think it's partially because the Liberals can help themselves, but they're also, I mean, I'm a partisan conservative. They're also running away from the record a little bit. And there's some issues there. So I think all of it has an effect one way or another. There's probably going to be a change in who's running the US Congress this fall. It looks like the Republicans are going to do well both in the Senate and in Congress. There'll be some issues that they'll obviously come to a loggerhead with the president. And that will have some effect. That will have some effect on our politics here. It always does. I agree it's not great. I agree with Mike in that it's not great. And that our cultures are certainly very different, but there are always effects and there are always unintended consequences because, you know, we're the hat on top of the United States. And so there's always issues that seem to spill over.
Yeah, I want to say, I don't want to be misunderstood. I simply don't like the transference, particularly the abortion issue, because it's just not the same test here.
Oh, I agree. But
I agree with you. There's something going on in the Western world, this whole populist versus elitist globalist thing that's going on. And it is affecting Canada. And there's no question that Mr. Poilievre is on to 100%. Something with that. Mr. Charest would be totally opposed. And that's why I say there is a big difference between these two candidates on that kind of dimension. You're absolutely right about that.
Let's transition to the third part of your question.
Your last question about Conservatives won the popular vote the last couple of elections, but didn't win enough seats. It's an interesting paradox, right? I was talking about the importance of Quebec earlier, and we managed to hang on to our seats there. But this is why every seat matters on the periphery, right? Winning a few seats in Quebec may mean the difference between displacing the Liberals this time or the next time. But the one thing that's kind of interesting is it helps to think about it this way. Think of it less as think of us more like different provinces and different regions and competing for those votes, right? We were basically shut out of the Lower Mainland last time, more or less last election, and we were basically shut out of the GTA again. One of the things I've started to notice in my time in politics, and you know, Harold's just down the road in the Kitchener-Waterloo region when he was in office, the GTA tends to kind of go one way. If you remember when Mr. Harper won his majority, he won every seat from Lake Ontario all the way to Ottawa. And then when Mr. Trudeau came in, he won every seat from Ottawa all the way back to Lake Ontario. And it kind of goes in one direction. So you see these big swings. It's true, Conservatives are winning the popular vote, but we're running up the score in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we have, I think, almost every seat now in Saskatchewan. And we had almost every seat in Alberta until the last election. The Liberals and the NDP won a few back. But, you know, it's kind of the opposite. It happened to Jean Charest in the 90s as well. Chrétien would win the popular vote quite handily, but he would win almost no seats outside of Quebec and Ontario. I think in one of the elections, Mike would know for sure, I think he had 101 out of the 103 seats in Ontario, right? It's just one of these effects of our system. But things like the popular vote do matter when it comes to actually governing and actually trying to get your agenda implemented and having that robust mandate. And if we're in a situation, Mike's the expert, he can speak to this, but if we're in a situation where we have the same number of seats as the Liberals, technically the Governor General lets the Liberal government continue if they so choose, right? But if the Conservative Party has the biggest amount in terms of the popular vote, but the same number of seats, there is an argument to be made that maybe they should have a crack at government, particularly if the Liberals look like they can't quite get it together. But that may not be constitutionally 100% correct, but it does have an effect on how these things are decided if things are awfully razor close, which hasn't happened since, I think, the 1970s, right, Mike?
Yeah. This question also raises the whole issue of electoral reform, and the whole, we have the English first past the post, system. But I've got to say, in the context of a conservative, a center-right party in Canada, I would be opposed to any attempt to change the current model. If we move off first past the post to any kind of preferential, mixed member proportional, single transferable ballot systems, and some of our guests will be familiar with those from their countries, it will almost guarantee we'll never elect a center-right majority conservative government ever again in Canada. The nature of Canadian politics is, with the first past the post system, with the right allocation on a good day and the right split, 38 to 40% of the vote can get you a majority government in this country, and 40% is about the ceiling, with all due respect, for center-right vote in Canada, at least as I see the country right now. So if the questioner is asking about whether we should change our electoral system, despite it creates this disproportion where a party gets more votes but less seats, I would be myself personally opposed to changing that system at all. I think the question is alluding to a particular international agreement that's being worked out through the World Health Organization.
Yes.
And there has been some, I'm not an expert on this, but there has been some issues expressed to what extent countries are going to give up their autonomy on medical and epidemic issues. She's raised that. None of the other candidates seem to want to touch it. I think part of it, though, I've watched the media coverage and no one seems to really know the answer to it. Everybody sort of attacks each other on the issue. She's been attacked, but I've seen no information from her nor from the other side telling me what this treaty or this proposed agreement will do. So it's a bit, I think there's just a lack of information, but I do think maybe a lot of the candidates really don't want to touch it without more detail.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing about this issue, again, I think it's one of these things where I think they're again, a lot of it is out of concern of COVID restrictions, vaccine mandates, and the controversial role the WHO has played, which I'm sympathetic to. But I also think it's one that it just isn't resonating, I think, across the Conservative membership. Otherwise, the other candidates would be all over it. I think the other thing I would say is, Dr. Lewis has her PhD in international law. She's written papers on a number of issues like this. I've read some of them, and she has some fairly non-traditional views when it comes to the role international law plays, particularly in Canada, particularly organizations. And so my issue with her taking on this issue in particular is it's not what she said in her papers before about, and she's quite supportive of international organizations in the UN, which is a very sort of traditional conservative view on the role those organizations play in our politics. So I share her concern, but I kind of have some worry about that given what she's written in the past. But I do think they are speaking to elements within the party. I just don't think it's having as much resonance across the party. Otherwise, you definitely would see Pierre or perhaps even Charest come at it from the other end of being supportive of the WHO. Maybe if they saw some calculation that said if you say this, you might get you might get some more support. But Mike could be right too. Part of it could be, some of the frontrunners are a little gun shy in trying to address some of these issues.
Okay, well, thank you, all of you, for participating, and thanks especially to Adam and Mike for joining us today, for the wisdom they've shared with us. But this illustrates a couple things to me. It illustrates that as Canadians, we have an obligation to learn as much as we possibly can from as wide of a variety of speakers and experts as we can, and we have a job to do there. But it also reminds me, as we were gathered today under the auspices of Christian Embassy, and we heard from Kathy Wagenthal, who chairs the National Prayer Breakfast, that as parliamentarians and as leaders, we are ultimately relying on God for wisdom, and we want to appeal to Him for wisdom to know what to do in the times that are so challenging, and they're challenging for all of you, and I recognize that. So I want to just close with a brief word of prayer for our leaders and for the process of our leadership selection, that God's will would be done. Father, I thank you for Mike and Adam and for others like them who have put their minds to understanding the big issues of our times. And I pray your continued blessing on them. And we lift up particularly today all of the leaders of our country, of our nations that are all represented here. And I pray that you would give them a deep sense of humility, recognizing that in spite of the great wisdom you've given them rationally, that ultimately, Lord, you are the source of our authority and wisdom. So we appeal to you to give us wisdom to rule and to put into place the processes that will lead our people in ways that will be good for them and good for our whole world. We pray in the power of Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.